Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 54. So, first of all, I want to start off with a quick apology for the gap since the last episode. I'm currently juggling a whole bunch of things at the moment, but don't worry, this podcast certainly is not going away. Episodes are just a bit less frequent at the moment. And in this episode, I'm joined by Matt Hunt, and we're going to talk about big balls of mud. So, welcome to the show, Matt, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I've actually been meaning to ask you on the show for a while. And recently I went to a DGD Southwest conference event and watched your talk, which was really, really good. Lots of good stuff in there. And I knew at that point I'd really have to get you on. But I got pulled into conversations, and then every time I saw you, you were in conversations chatting. So we never actually caught up at the event.
Yeah, that is a shame. It was quite a nice event, actually. And to go on first, I was quite pleased with that, to get it out the way. But then, unfortunately, some poor gentleman passed out halfway through my talk. So that was a little bit off-putting, to say the least. But I hear he's okay, and it was a good event and a good talk. So I'm glad we finally caught up. Definitely.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I had forgotten about that actually. And he was seated right at the top in the middle, above the centre set of stairs, wasn't he? So that could have been very nasty.
It could have been very nasty. Yeah. So I'm glad he's okay.
So could you introduce yourself to the listeners and just tell us a bit about what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Matt Hunt. Been a software developer now for nearly 20 years. And one day I'm going to actually be able to say 20 years, and I'll be happy then, a nice round number. But yeah, so I've been working mainly the last sort of 10 years as a contractor, and with the last 5 years, mainly sort of in the finance area. And for no specific reason, I've always fallen into sort of the back-end API development side of things. But then the first part of my career was really based around digital agencies and all the fun that comes with that. The fun and the time pressures.
Been there, done that.
Yeah, I think it's a rite of passage these days. Yeah, so that's a bit about me. I'm currently working for a startup bank called Zero. We're actually sort of looking towards the sustainability side of things. So we're a bank with a conscience and a purpose, hopefully helping people get to net zero.
Hence the name.
Hence the name Zero, yeah. So it's, yeah, so very early days. So we'll see how that goes.
Awesome stuff. So before we dive into big, massive balls of mud, I just wanted to mention to everyone that I've actually recently started a newsletter. So I kind of enjoy writing and thought it'd be a nice way to consolidate all the bits I do. So the podcast, YouTube channel, .NET Oxford. And also I'm going to include links to news items and picks that I found interesting this past month. So it'll be a monthly newsletter, and the first one will go out on Thursday, so 1st of June. So obviously in the future from us chatting now, but in the past from when this episode goes out, when I edit this episode. But you'll be able to, I think on the subscribe page, it shows past episodes anyway. But yeah, I'll include a link to subscribe to that on the in the show notes. And also just a quick reminder to everyone that the podcast is on Discord now, so you can join via the link on the website, which is the unhandledexceptionpodcast.com. And lastly, a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. Right, now that's over and done with, let's talk about big balls of mud. What is a big ball of mud?
So a big ball of mud is generally sort of the deterioration of sort of code quality over time. There's lots of different ways you can just describe this. It's kind of better to be described as spaghetti code, I think, where things are pointing all across the code base. There's dependencies linked left, right, and center. There's been hacks put in that sort of people think, well, we go back and do that, and then never get time to go back. There's also a big ball of mud is potentially hard to test. And as with the big ball of mud that you see a sort of a dung beetle push in, over time the mud gets bigger and bigger and bigger and never gets cleaned, essentially. One of the things that happens is that people come in and see a bit of bad code, or they don't realize it's bad code, or they don't realize it's a hack, and then they sort of emulate that. I know as a contractor, when I went into companies, I was expected to deliver straight away. So part of doing that was being able to identify a pattern that was already in the code base. Now, if there's not any sort of good patterns or practices laid out in that code base, I used to just have to do my best, essentially, and sometimes emulate what's already there. So big ball of mud, if there's bad code in there, someone might come along, like the next developer in the line, come along and replicate the badness that's already there, and it gets bigger and bigger and worse. So over time, sort of, it's just the quality goes down to the point where it's hard to change, hard to debug.
Yeah, I've worked, like, 'cause I'm a contractor and I've worked with quite a few different companies, and just seeing most companies have those big balls of mud because you've had multiple members of staff going in. They're used to different patterns, different ways of doing things, and they'll do it their own way. And over many years where different people have got their hands in that big ball of mud doing things in different ways, it just gets, you've got to have patterns around it to actually protect against that, because if you don't, the technical debt's going to grow, especially where you've got the business asking for features and stuff faster than you can fix technical debt.
Yeah, this is very much a problem that I've seen over the years, especially with digital agencies and people that are under a time crunch. If you're paid to do a specific job from start to end, then the code's got to be written, and it gets written badly just to try and get it done. And then I've seen companies as well that I would describe them as feature factories. They think that their code will be better if the more features they put in. So features are priority, and paying back the tech debt sort of never gets paid back. And the tech debt is not a bad thing as long as it doesn't turn to bad debt. And you have to pay that debt back, unfortunately, otherwise it'll come and bite you. And I've worked on plenty of systems where the tech debt wasn't given time. Like the business wanted to just feature, and then it gets to a point where they can't get their features because the code is set in such a bad state that the time to create those new features gets longer and longer and longer, to the point where one day one of the developers will come along and say, right, I've got a good idea, let's rewrite this. And yeah, so the cycle just continues, unfortunately, until someone breaks out of that cycle or realizes what they're doing wrong. Yeah, so like the point of all of this, when I started doing my talk around this subject, was just because I've worked in so many of those places, and I thought there's got to be a better way. And I remember quite a few years in my career just thinking, how can I make this better? There must be some way. I'm doing something wrong. And you sort of you read blog post after blog post. A lot of developers these days, they learn from the internet, and the blog posts will tell you like a little snippet of this bit and a little snippet of that bit, but never really the full picture. So people sort of go down the wrong path. I do remember once I worked for a rather large company. I was helping a junior out who had read all of the blog posts in the world and then put all that knowledge from all these blog posts into this one small piece of functionality that you had to create. and like it was wonderful. It was actually laid out quite well. It had all the patterns in. The only unfortunate thing was that it didn't actually do what it was meant to do. So there was thousands of classes, thousands of lines of code. And so eventually we went back to sort of first principles, tore it all up and said, right, what do we need to do? And it turned out we need to take a SQL table and put it into a CSV file. So one class in the end did that. But yeah, so the point with there I was trying to make was that sort of people go down the wrong route sometimes, and I've just always tried to find a better way of it, which is sort of trying to get myself out of this mud and not get into it in the first place. I failed many times at not getting into it.
I think everyone has, hasn't they?
Yeah.
I think just with the whole, like, lots of developers getting their hands in, even if you've got a good pattern, then it's so hard to enforce that because you've got to constantly be checking to make sure everyone's following those patterns, new developers, people that are being pressured by the business and just need to get something quick and want to cut corners, because people do. People always will try and cut corners. But how do you get people to follow patterns like CQS or whatever pattern you decide is the right way to go? One of my favourite patterns is KISS. Keep it super simple. That's the nice way of doing the acronym. And recently I've been involved with doing quite a few interviews, and quite often I've found that the candidate hasn't actually managed to solve the task at the end. It's a technical interview at the end of the test because they've gone in and created abstractions, layers, different projects for different things before they've even got. It's quite a simple. I'm not going to say what the actual requirement is, just in case I do it again. But it's quite a simple requirement. It's not complicated. But quite a few people just don't do it in time because they don't keep it simple, and they try and create lots of services and extra projects, like different layers and everything, rather than just do it, then refactor it.
Yeah, I'm very much a keep it simple kind of guy. I like my sort of I like my code to be easy to read, easy to maintain, and sort of as little code as possible. I think that's something that we get from TDD these days as well. And only recently I read Robert Martin's book on clean code. I was on holiday and I had some time, so I sat by the pool sipping my cocktail, reading that, and I came across the 3 laws of TDD, and I made a note of them. The 3rd law says you may not write more production code than is sufficient to pass the currently failing test, and I think that's something that sort of people could learn from in lots of ways, because you will end up with otherwise with this spaghetti code if you write too much, for sure.
Yeah, I kind of, on the flip side of that with TDD, I've worked for companies where they do take TDD to the extreme, and basically every single class is TDD'd and everything else is mocked. And where you were saying before about not being able to make changes because you've got so much technical debt, I found the same with tests, not being able to do refactoring improvements because all the tests break. And nowadays I'm a strong advocate of, I hate to use the term integration test because that might not be the right word, but as in using mocks as little as possible. That's probably the best way of saying it. So rather than mocking stuff out, just actually, like ASP.NET Core has the Web Application Factory, which does an integration test against the API. So that's simulating what the end user, so it's an API call, so the end user might be a machine, but it's simulating the requirement of that API. So with one test, you're getting, it's testing everything in, I was going to say startup.cs, but now program.cs. So it's testing all that stuff. It's testing your dependency injection is set up. It's testing your, much more. You're getting so much more bang for buck. And you're free to completely refactor as long as you're not breaking the requirement. And you're not locking in by writing these tests that mock everything else. And even taking it a step further, I use Docker quite a lot to spin up databases and have the tests also testing against real databases. And that just saves so much time. You get so much more bang for buck from your tests, but you've not got the lock-in of what mocking does. Hi, this is Editing Dan. So I just wanted to pause and just say that what I just said then about integration tests, you can totally do that in a TDD fashion. I realised it sounded a bit like I was saying, oh, I don't like TDD because you get into that situation and integration tests are better. That's not what I meant. I quite often do TDD using these integration tests. All I meant was that quite often when I see code bases that do full-on TDD, it's typically lots and lots of unit tests with everything else being mocked. It doesn't have to be the case, though, when doing TDD. Anyway, I just wanted to clarify that, so back to the show.
Yeah, so that's definitely something that I've seen a lot more in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, especially in some of the finance or fintech companies that I've worked in, is that we're moving completely away from unit tests and just testing sort of the API as a whole. One thing that I do a lot of is sort of trying to mock as realistically as possible sort of the cloud infrastructure. So I use Azure a lot, so I'm trying to mock the parts of my code that are Azure based, or the SDK, I should say, mocking the SDK that connects to Azure, so that I'm not mocking any of my own code. And as you say, just exercising the API from the client call all the way through to the sort of the layers of your system or however you've built your code. Yeah, and the as soon as you write a unit test, you've locked in that design, which once you get into your big ball of mud, there's no realistic way out. You're locked into this architecture that you've chosen rightly or wrongly, and it may not even be a recognized pattern. It may just be a load of code thrown together, and it's very hard to change. And at least if you can change it, you end up rewriting your tests, and then you've sort of lost the original intent, so to speak. You could end up writing your tests wrong, and then with these wrong tests, you've sort of everything's passing, but the system still doesn't work once you've done this big refactor. So I think, there's moving away from unit tests in the situation where the unit or system under test is a class. I think that's where I've seen a lot of people go, and it's a great idea. I do see a lot of pushback though. People sort of look at this and think, "What you've got to unit test every single class." And I'm like, that's never been a thing. The system under test is what you're testing, not a class. So once people see the power of that in real life, I think they sort of get where it's going and what's good about that.
Yeah, definitely. A class is an implementation detail. It's not part of the requirement. The requirement doesn't know what a class is.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
So with CQS, how does that help solve the problem? Well, in fact, so we probably should take a step back and say, define what CQS is actually.
Yes.
And maybe how it differs to CQRS, which is another term we hear going around.
Yeah, the CQRS seems to be everywhere, but not a lot of people understand it, and or they don't know its ins and outs and where it should be used. But moving away from that, CQS is the command query separation pattern, and this is something I discovered actually in a series of blog posts by Steven van Derzen of Simple Injector fame, if it is famous. I used to use Simple Injector a lot. That's how I got onto his blog posts. He very much liked Solid, and so that was sort of, I was on a journey of learning Solid at the time. And I came across some blog posts. One is called Meanwhile on the query side of my architecture, and then there's a converse one, Meanwhile on the command side of my architecture. And he explains the command query separation principle very well. And I initially, I wanted a better pattern than just your sort of N-tier, business, data, UI. And so I was looking at CQRS, but CQRS is sort of there's two sides to CQRS. It's basically you're separating out the whole of your sort of infrastructure into two sides, a complete read side and a complete write side. And then they're joined via some sort of message queue normally, or some sort of events, which brings eventual consistency. So that was sort of too big a pattern for a lot of systems I was using. And I have seen people shoehorn that in because it was a buzzword for a long time. So when I found command query separation, I kind of did a little jump for joy, because it was nice and neat. It's all in process. There's no need to separate your infrastructure. And so CQRS, it states that everything should either be a command that performs an action, or a query that returns data to the caller, but never both. So never cross the streams. There's the commands are there to mutate data and should never return any state from the system. And then queries are there to return the current state of the system or the data. I always try and think of these as two little stories. So for the query, I always think, right, so if I was in Curry's or Dixon's, then I go up to a salesperson and I say, how much is this television? All I want to know that's my query. All I want to know is the price. I don't expect them to tell me the price, charge my card, and put the telly in the back of my car. So that's a query. So I just want information. And commands I always think of as when I want my daughter to tidy a room. So I want her to go and do the action that I'm asking her. So I'm asking her to tidy my room. And so I don't want any back chat from her. Just want her to go away and tidy the room, perform the action.
Does that command ever throw unhandled exceptions?
Sometimes I have the door shut in my face. So this a couple of times where it'd be nice if my daughter did talk back to me. One of them would be if she didn't quite understand what I was asking her to do. That normally would come back as a what? Then if she's done it, then brilliant. I'd like to know that it's finished and that she's performed the action that I've asked and not just sat on her phone talking to her friends. And then there's the last one. If the house or if a bedroom catches fire when she's tidying it, I'd like to know that so we can put the fires out and carry on. And sort of those three things map to sort of really realistically success, true, false. So you could return that from a command. Any validation errors, so she doesn't understand. And then any exceptions that are thrown. So for me, those are the only three things that I really would like to get back from my command. I haven't done sort of a talk about this a few times. A lot of people always ask, what about database generated IDs? And I both love and hate that question in equal measure.
Well, you just pinched my next question. Like, I know the answer, but it's kind of I had to ask it because that's like the canonical. Is that the right word? Canonical question for this kind of stuff, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah. So yeah, it's for me. I don't generally let my database do anything now.
GUIDs all the way.
GUIDs all the way. And I try and take any sort of, I don't use stored procedures. I try and take any business logic out of my database because to me, I always think it's just a data store. It's a place I put data and information. I don't want it to do anything else. So for IDs, I normally generate the ID as a GUID while I'm generating the command. So I know already what the ID is going to be, so I don't need to return it. There are cases where if you've got a clustered index on an ID field, you will lose performance if you're putting in sort of unsequenced GUIDs. There are packages. I think I've seen some packages. A colleague sent me a package the other day that was produced sequenced GUIDs, which would help with sort of the clustered index problem. But then for me, I generally don't use SQL Server or haven't done for many years. It's always been like a document database like Cosmos or something along those lines. Or even my last project, I used a lot of table storage. So a lot of those problems go away.
If you did want to make an exception, just say, okay, in this case, a command is going to return just an ID, nothing else, just an ID. Is that kind of acceptable or does that go against everything CQS?
I think any exception to the rule is acceptable as long as you've documented it somewhere. One of the points that I always raise as well about how to stop yourself getting in a big ball of mud is just have a good README in your repository. I think just a couple of lines on what the intention was initially is always good. So if you are going to have that exception, put it inside a README. The README should be a living document as well. I've worked with some guys who are very good at doing this. And every time there's a sort of an architectural change or there's a pattern that's been introduced or removed, then it's always documented in the README. And it only has to be like a couple of lines long. But yeah, just putting that in there, I think gives the next developer sort of the intent, what the original intent was, that they can carry forward so that they're not reinventing the wheel or they're not doing something wrong, or they can just pick the code up and run with it a lot quicker. Yeah, so just little things like that definitely help with sort of any exceptions that you do put in, like returning IDs from commands. I think there's no hard and fast rules with any of these patterns. I think as long as you can communicate what you've done clearly so that the next person come along can pick it up, then yeah, I think you're fine.
With the README thing as well, it's kind of, I guess there's a balance there as well. If you've got a README which is like a novel, then no one's ever going to read it. So there's that much information in. So it's finding the right balance between what's too much information and what's not enough.
Yeah, definitely. It's just a couple of headings around the sort of design with a couple of bullet points. Everyone loves bullet points. I
yeah, definitely
bullet points all the time. Yeah, and I think the next person will appreciate the brevity of it.
So this is a complete tangent. I used to use a note-taking app called Workflowy. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's basically the whole premises is around bullet points, but it's kind of, you can click onto a bullet point and drill into it. Like obviously I've indented bullet points, but you can drill, it becomes a massive tree.
Oh my goodness. I need this in my life.
The reason I stopped using it is because it doesn't, well, it might do now, but it didn't support things like images and just more richness. It was just text-based. But there was loads of keyboard shortcuts and you can drill down into each nested level of the bullet-pointed tree. And basically an entire project in your notes was kind of like a bullet point at some point in that nested tree of indented bullet points. But it didn't feel like that because you could bookmark it. There was lots of stuff around it to manage it. It was basically just a massive hierarchy of notes. Very powerful.
Yeah, and another tangent you mentioned earlier. So me and Dan have had a few technical issues trying to get the recording of this done.
Oh, I knew this was coming.
Yeah, and what I genuinely wasn't going to say anything, but then I just noticed one of the soundproofing things fell off the back of your door behind you. And I thought Dan's office is literally falling apart. Everybody, quick, buy him a coffee, quick.
It's kind of like today is just, it's one of those days. To add a bit more context, we started recording. I normally use Riverside FM to actually do the recording, which is kind of like this podcasting platform. We jumped in. I had the wrong mic selected, so I changed the other mic and the whole thing crashed and wouldn't accept my mic at all. So I had to reboot and it still wouldn't accept my mic. So in the meantime, we're having like conversations while I'm rebooting on Discord, like with me being very, very apologetic. But it just wouldn't work at all. So now we're trying to record on Zoom. Well, so no, we're chatting on Zoom, but we're recording individually, locally. I think I'm using Audition, you're using Audacity.
Yeah, I've always wondered how these podcasts were recorded, Dan, and now I still don't know.
I wish I did. Oh, dear. It's normally a lot smoother than this. This is just so embarrassing. But anyway. But then, then these tiles stuck on with blue tack and they're constantly falling off. It's so annoying.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to get some super glue or something, I think.
Cool.
On that note.
Yeah.
Oh, funny. So on that note, changing the subject from my many, many failures, let's go back to CQS. Would you write handler code to manage this separation yourself, or would you use like a library like Mediator or something?
Yeah, so there are a few libraries out there, like Mediator. There's another one which all your listeners will know about. It's sort of Brighter and Darker. Those are the two big ones that I know of anyway. There's Mediator, in my experience, gets a really bad reputation for its implementation, and I find that it's the way that people use it. Me personally, I think is wrong. I think people say that about a lot of Jimmy Bogart's libraries. Automapper being the other one. I've seen terrible implementations of that.
I know Nick Japsas has lots of fun taking the mick out of Jimmy, I think.
Yeah. So the libraries are the way to go. Like I've got my own set of classes that I use to implement it, and it doesn't actually take that much if you use a bit of DI magic just to pass, a command to a command handler or a query to a query handler. So you can do that. And so speaking of the handlers, each command and each query would have its own handler where all the business logic goes. This is one thing that I specifically like about this pattern. You've got a command or a query that is just a POCO, plain old C# object or record these days rather than a class. And then that's just got the information in it that the command or handler or query handler needs to fulfill the request. And then your business logic, so to speak, will just live inside the handler. One thing that I like about this, you have the command handler, you can almost use English language in the naming of things. So like order product or get invoice or something along those lines. So it gives you the sort of nice sort of language inside your classes that this class just does this one thing. And then if you need to sort of think about the open close principle, which I don't do often enough, to be honest, because you've got this command and you've got the command handler, if you ever needed to do a different version of it, you don't need to change those classes. You can leave all your tests intact and you can just create a new version of that. Literally call it, like if it was get order, call the class get order v2 and then have a handler called like get order v2 handler. I think people shy away from doing things like that and they'd rather change the code that they've got. But sometimes just leaving the working code where it is and creating a new one is brilliant, which is why one of the many reasons why I like CQS.
Would you add that kind of version to maybe on a feature toggle or something so you can swap it to the new version or back again quickly and then maybe get rid of V1 once you know everything's working?
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure there's loads of mechanisms to do the sort of feature toggling. So if you were sort of building an API, then inside your controller, just have a toggle inside there. Say, is this version 1 or is it version 2? And flip back and forth as needed. And then mark things as obsolete. That's what I tend to like doing. Mark your code as obsolete once you've created a new version and just leave it in there for a while. You never know when you might have to go back to it. And then at some point in the future, make a note of it though, so you don't forget. Go in and remove it. I like removing code. I don't know about anyone else, but yeah, deleting code is very satisfying. So yeah, it's definitely a job I like doing, is going back and removing all the obsolete stuff.
So I can just picture your commands. Tell daughter to tidy room V 875.
Yeah. Hopefully the system would never get that high, and hopefully I'd never have to keep refactoring that much to get it to get her to do what I want.
I think if it was my kids, it'd be like 2,700,000 version.
My daughter's amazing. I shouldn't actually pick on it, but it makes it for a good story. So there's handlers. Just going back to handlers, they're very good for doing a lot with little code. One of the things that I've talked about a million times is having all the side effects in your main sort of code line. There's things like login. Well, that's the big one. So I should explain side effects. So side effects are really not the main event. So byproduct, let's say that it's called a byproduct command handler, then you just want that handler to do all and just the code to buy the product. If you need to then send a message to like a fulfillment team or something, like be it an SMS or an email, then that's a side effect. So that's something that happens as an effect of the main thing happening. So I don't think that you should put that sort of stuff inside your handlers. That's how come you get to this point where you've got a service class, let's say, that are my nemesis, with like thousands and thousands of lines of code, because it's like, right, well, this method is going to do this one thing, but then also we're going to do these other 20 things after the fact, and they're all side effects. So I think in a handler, keeping it small and concise, like just do what you need to do. Again, go back to sort of the TDD. Once your test has passed, start writing code. And I think it's nice to have a little amount of code in there. Like a lot of things that I write these days have like 10 lines of code in the actual handle method, and that's it, we're done. But then the sort of the secret sauce then is the event side of things. Now, events are a massive topic. There's so many different types of events, but in CQS, an event, or you could call it a domain event, is just a note to other parts of the system to say that something happened. So if you did this byproduct, it's a terrible example. It sounds like byproduct. Order thing, we'll call it, this order thing command. So you've done the order in the thing, then you'd want to have an event that would say thing ordered. It's kind of like using the English, so it's now past tense. That thing happened in the past, and you're essentially just changing the words around in the name of your command. So then you say, so we've ordered our thing. So you fire off an event saying thing ordered, and then you can have many handlers then that listen out for that. So if you need to do more than one thing after sort of your main thing has been bought, then you don't have to put it all into one class again or into one method. So you can have like events are one to many. So you have one event handlers to do all the different things that you need to do. So like send an SMS to Dave, or email the customer, or what have you. So yeah, that's where you can sort of keep your code nice and clean. You've got small classes that do just that one thing. There's that saying, isn't there? Do one thing and do it well. I don't even think it needs to do it well. I only think it needs to do it well enough to pass your test. And then stop. Otherwise you might write too much.
Yeah, I kind of think about like that kind of event as a broadcast event, because as you say, it's kind of like something's happened, an order's been created or whatever it is, it broadcasts that event, and it doesn't know or care what the consumer is. You've got consumer, and then the consumers, each consumer has a single responsibility. Oh, an order's been created, I need to send an email out. Oh, and something else. Oh, an order's been created, I need to do some payment gateway stuff, whatever it is. But each of those handlers or consumers of that event, basically they're in isolation, they're very decoupled.
Yeah, definitely. The one thing, I was trying not to say anything around the word broadcast, because that sort of just brings me back to the CQRS pattern, where you're sending an event through sort of like a pub sub, sort of like a topic and subscription, which is sort of not what the CQS is about. It's all sort of in process, or that's the way that I build it. You can make it bigger and then send it down a pub sub. Yeah, so going back to keep it simple. So yeah, so it is a broadcast event, but only in the sort of realms of your system that you're working on now, not the sort of wider architecture or the wider system.
Doesn't Mediator refer that as a notification?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, it's although it's been I need to brush up on mediator. After your podcast about Brighter, I've been delving in that lately, so I'm losing the mediator from my mind and loading all the
Ian Cooper will be definitely happy to hear that. But
yeah.
we've had a few episodes on mediator, but I don't know whether they've been explicitly on mediator, or they've definitely just come up in conversations. Quite a while ago, I had an episode with Nick Chapsas, and we broke the whole thing down into multiple different topics. One of them was mediator. There was a bunch of other ones. So rather than just have one topic, we had different subtopics. But yeah, we definitely dug into mediator then. And it's come up. It's one of these libraries that just comes up in conversation quite often. So yeah, it's definitely been covered a lot.
Yeah, I was quite gutted when I discovered it, actually, because I was on the cusp of writing essentially that myself, and I thought I'll just check to see if there's anything out in the world that does this, and yeah, bumped into that. So I was gutted and happy at the same time.
I must admit, the way I use mediator, I don't need to use mediator. It's kind of I use it because you get handlers out of the box, and it kind of forces a pattern, but I could equally do the same pattern by just having a class called something handler and having a method called execute on it. It wouldn't have to need to go through like a library like mediator. But I think when you have lots of different developers and maybe they've used mediator in the past, it's just a common pattern that is easily understood. There's documentation around it. You're forced, if you use a mediator handler, it derives from an interface and you're forced to have that exact execute method. But yeah, with handlers, I've whether it's mediator or whatever it is, I'm a huge fan of that pattern where it's a handler, application logic, single responsibility, supports dependency injection. The name of it is very much what it's doing. So I can look at in my solution explorer in the IDE and very quickly find what I want to find because it's just all consistent. And other things like mass transit has a concept of handlers, which is called a consumer, and it's exactly the same pattern. It feels very familiar. We've said mediator. The Brighter also has exactly the same pattern. So regardless of the technology, and you've said you implement it yourself, but you've still got handlers. This whole pattern of handlers, I just really love it.
Yeah, this is something that sort of was one of the things, I should say, that appealed to me when I first discovered this pattern, because everyone sort of defaults to having this service class. And it becomes a dumping ground for everything. And it's always like order service, product service, and it's sort of, entity name service.
I'm going to raise your nemesis of service class and see you with manager class. Those are even, have you seen those in code, like managers, and it's like 5 billion lines long?
Yeah, I've escaped manager classes, I think, to that extent. But yeah, service, I think they're one and the same, really. Just it's a I would say a rose by any other name, but I think it's a thorn by any other name. This I think a while back when DDD started becoming a thing, people were like, all right, so they've read the blue book and they're thinking, right, there's a thing called a service class. That's it now. That's where all my logic's going to go. And I occasionally go back over my DDD books. I've got one by Vaughan Vernon, which is implementing domain-driven design. And I think one of the things that I go over again and again in that book is the definition of a service. And they've got, I think it's an application service, and there's another kind. It's either domain or business service or something along those lines. And none of those definitions ever marry up to what I see in real code. It's just a dumping ground for everything. And there's many ways to do one thing. And it gets to a point where it's a mess. Another thing that sort of I see in that is that people quite often have very anemic domain models, which is another thing that, so I've written one of my favorite projects years ago that we wrote. We had service classes with an anemic domain model. So a domain model that's just classes with getters and setters, no logic in the actual domain models themselves. And we thought it was brilliant. And then I went away because I was a contractor, and I went back to contract at that same company. And then I looked at it after many years of people following those patterns and doing the same things as us, and it was just a mess. And so I'm now a big advocate of sort of having that domain model, that strong domain model with the logic inside the entities and the aggregates themselves, because then you can't change that model without going through the business rules. You have to call a method on that model, or that entity or aggregate. So I think that sort of links in back to the handlers, where if you've got your handler just loads up an entity or aggregate or what have you, and then it calls the method on it. So you've got defined sort of places where your logic sort of realistically exists. Sort of like the mutation of an entity is done by the entity itself, and then the handler calls that method to do that mutation. And sort of it's having those clear places where things are done to stop you getting these dumping grounds of code and horribleness.
And another one to be honest, so when I first started using Mediator, for a very small period of time, I was guilty of this myself. Having the application logic in a handler in Mediator, which calls a, air quotes, listeners can't see me doing this, repository that actually does entity framework code. And now I just put like injecting the data context into my handler and do it there, because entity framework is an abstraction, and it's just saves so much time rather than faffing around with the headaches of repositories and things.
Yeah, that's very much where I've gone these days as well. One of my first things I'd do when I'm setting out my stall was write a repository class. And you just don't need it. As you say, the data context is an abstraction already. And I've seen people wrap that in a unit of work, but it is a unit of work already.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm like, what are you doing? So I generally just inject my data context into the constructor, call whatever it is I need to mutate, do my mutation and save it back.
I think it makes a big difference because these handlers are very small, as you mentioned before, that single responsibility. There's probably just 10 lines of code. There's not a lot there. And with Entity Framework, the link is quite succinct. It's just so much. Going back to this KISS acronym as well, it's just keeping it simple, very easy to update and see what's going on. It just makes life a lot easier and code a lot more maintainable.
Yeah, very much so. Sometimes I have seen a need where a repository or something like that was sort of advisable, or was needed, I should say. And one thing that I've looked at was Steve Smith, or Steve Adalis Smith, has got a lovely specification pattern library to do that. So sort of create an abstraction layer between your business logic and your repository. And I find that's quite a nice clean sort of pattern to work with.
I haven't seen that one. I'll have a look and pop it in the show notes.
Yeah. Like I've only used it once, if I'm being perfectly honest, but I like the ideas behind it. If you do need to have that sort of separation and not inject your data context. So one thing, thinking about sort of command handlers and having very little code or as least code as possible inside them, brings me back to another thing that I learned from Steven van Derzen, was that this thing called aspect-orientated programming. And it's just a form of sort of separation of concerns. The archetypal example that I always give for this is login. I don't know about you, but I've been in situations where the first thing that you do in the project is you write logger.information and then give it like the name of the method and perhaps some information about the parameters being passed in or something. Well, that just gets messy. There's so much repetition in that, and while I'm not a fully advocate of dry, I do think that it'd be better, or it is better, to have login and validation sort of called from one place. So with our commands and our handlers, we can, in between the command getting passed to the command handler, we could have a login handler and a validation handler that pretend in the system, they pretend to be the actual handler. And then it sort of uses, or can use, the decorator pattern in like a pipeline fashion. Very much like the sort of ASP middleware pipeline, where you can slot things in that are executed in order. So now you can just have your login in one place. So the command will get passed to this login handler, do air quotes around handler, it's not really a handler. And then it'll do its login, so it'll log everything you need to do, and then it'll call the actual command handler. And I think that's a much better way. I always tempted to say, what if you want to change your login system? Well, that's like the old story about what if you wanted to change a database and stuff. Does it ever happen? Maybe, maybe not. But it's not all about that. It's about having sort of that code in its own place. So all your login is called from one specific place. And then you can move on to sort of having validation or authentication or caching. So all in this pipeline, all being called from that one place. So keeping code simple, small, and sort of concise, or focused, I should say. Focus on the job that it's doing, and let let the other things carry on with what they're meant to be doing.
Yeah. I guess like where before I said with Mediator, the way I use Mediator, I could just have a class and called something handler. I hadn't thought about the Mediator pipelines where they call them behaviors, which is what you're describing, where you can actually create a pipeline of, I think if you're used to ASP.NET middleware, think like middleware, but for a particular request. And then you can add like validation and logging and stuff in that. So yeah, so I probably do use Mediator more than what I implied earlier, I guess.
Yeah, it's very handy for those sorts of things, and the whole pipeline is very good. So I always just wire it up with some fancy DI to do mine, but then perhaps under stress, my set of libraries might not work as well as Mediator, or Brighter, I should say. Let's not say Mediator is the only one there.
Well, I guess Brighter is kind of more, you're saying about in process. I think that's where like Mediator is in process, where Brighter can connect to message brokers and all that kind of thing. So I guess the comparison is probably more Mediator. So with your interfaces and stuff, where like your DIY version, have you kind of put that in a shared place so you can use it across all your different projects, or are you just copying and pasting?
I've been meaning to. This is in my current place of employment. It was one of actually my first jobs was to put this in. So I've got it. It's private to myself because I don't think it's fully fledged like Mediator. I would definitely either recommend people writing their own to work out how the pattern works as perhaps a learning thing, or having their own. Sometimes having this too much magic, I think, in a project is not always great. So like Mediator, while it is good and does the job, there is some sort of magic behind there that people might not understand how it fully works, or might want to know more about it. Well, obviously the code's online, but then you've got to then learn someone else's code. So just if you need it to be basic, then writing your own is quite easy and straightforward.
So obviously, if you've got a big ball of mud, there's going to be a lot of work to actually get out of that big ball of mud. And you've got management, which are probably not quite understanding what a big ball of mud means. What are some good reasons you can actually sell spending the time getting out of this problem to management?
So there's a few things that will definitely happen to your system or to the company itself, really. So like the total cost of ownership of the project or the product that you're building, that's going to go up. Obviously, with time is money, and having to pick through your big ball of mud every time you want to make a simple change is going to take longer. So productivity is going to go down. You're spending more on developers. You're trying to get your features out. Customers have been promised these features. Like some salespeople like to promise features, and then they take a lot longer to come out, which will be unhappy customers. Those are sort of some of the things that you can easily sell to companies. I think another one that is perhaps a harder sell, or is less obvious to sort of people that aren't in the tech industry, is the sort of the unhappiness of developers. I think working in a system and not being able to change it, or not given the time to change it, is quite detrimental to sort of developers' happiness. I know I've been unhappy with the status quo of places because I just haven't had the time to fix it, or I haven't been given the time to make the changes that need changes. And developers will leave eventually. I've come into companies where developers have left. I went into one company where literally 10 developers had just left all on the same day. And they were like, what are we going to do? So we started looking at it. And I was like, well, there's lots of problems here. And they said, well, we haven't got time to fix problems. We've got to make features. So yeah. So I left. But yeah, so and then I think that the ultimate thing, if you don't get to fixing it, will be that you end up having to rewrite it. It gets to the point where traction has stopped completely and you can't make any changes without introducing more bugs. And the bugs that you do introduce, you'll find that just take longer and longer to be found, and then may never be able to be fixed because you've written such in a way that the system's it's one big bug, I think. And I think also, I think as well, one of the things that can happen is the performance can go down. If you see, I saw one remarkable piece of code where they injected sort of dependency injection scope into another scope, and then they basically scope inside scope inside scope inside scope. And that just affected the performance massively because it was essentially spinning up a sort of a big object tree again and again and again. So yeah, with these big messy balls, the security can go down, the performance can go down, and the developer's happiness can definitely go down.
You made me laugh with your terms, and it reminded me of your slides where instead of balls of mud, they were like the poo emoji. Big piles of...
Yes, I have spent a lot of time trying to do that talk without mentioning this word, especially with those poo emojis. There's quite often I want to use expletives, but yeah, try not to. Yeah.
When you did your talk and some of your images were AI generated, that was quite funny.
Yeah, this was a weird situation. I wrote this talk a couple of years ago and then hadn't done it I did it once and then didn't do it for a long time. So when I had the chance to do it again, I went back over the slides and expanded on the talk, made it a bit more interesting. And I thought, well, I'll try this AI. So I think it was DALL-E that I used. I'd never done any chat GDP. I'd never done any DALL-E, any image generation. So I thought, well, let's see what goes on here. And then, I went down this very weird hole of asking it more and more bizarre things until essentially I came up with one of my slides referred to wrapping your ball of mud in tests. That's a good way of a good place to start if you're going to clean your thing. And I think that was the image that it wasn't a ball of mud that it was wrapping. And I think I had to stop. I closed the browser and everything. I haven't been back since, actually. Not to image generation. I don't think I trust myself.
Oh, I'll tell you what, I've been using Midjourney recently and it is insane. In fact, live on the podcast, I'm going to try generating a big ball of mud in Midjourney. Obviously, I can edit this and make it a bit less time consuming. What should we prompt it with?
I've always found that doing thing on the screen when people can only hear you is a great way to run a podcast.
Oh, it is. That's what I can edit it and just make time fly. Right, what should we prompt it with? I'll put the image that this generates in the show notes. A big ball of mud. I need to... What else can we add to this to make it a bit more interesting?
I don't know. I ended up asking it to wrap a piece of cellophane. I was just in this weird place that one evening, so it was... I don't know.
I'm just going to put a big ball of mud to see what it comes up with. But yeah, Midjourney is insane. It's kind of... I don't know whether you've seen some of the stuff it generates, but it looks like so realistic. We're talking about ChatGPT doing programmers out of work. This is definitely going to do artists out of work.
Seen it. I like this ASCII art, though.
Oh yeah, it's not very good with words and characters. It gets them all jumbled up.
DALL-E does that. I suspect that's something to do with not being able to forging stuff. Because every time I asked it to write stuff, it would jumble it all up.
I think the way it progressively generates images from noise just doesn't work well with...
Oh, yeah, of course.
With text.
Yeah. I tried mud and spaghetti was one thing that I tried searching for. I don't know why it's called a big ball of mud. It should be called a big ball of spaghetti horribleness, because that's what it actually is.
Let me share my screen. Can you see that?
Oh, yeah.
You can choose which one you prefer. So that's got someone's feet sticking out. So if we actually do...
Were they all generated?
Yeah.
No way.
This one. So it's going to upscale this one now. It just takes a minute. But anyway, that was a super tangent. But I will include the big ball of mud in the show notes for people to see.
Excellent.
Is there anything else you want to cover before we jump into dev tips?
No, don't mind. No.
Did you have a dev tip?
I did. I'm going to go with Clean Code by Robert Martin. I spent years kind of not avoiding reading it, but I never found the time. And recently I went away on holiday and had nothing to do on holiday. It was amazing. So I sat there and I read Clean Code. What was actually interesting was the first couple of chapters were very much like my presentation or my talk that I've been given. And I found a lot of similarities in that. So so I definitely think that Clean Code is a way to go, even if it's just the first couple of chapters that talk about sort of code and code craftsmanship and what Clean Code actually is. So that's my tech tip.
I think I read that a very, very long time ago. I will definitely include a link to that in the show notes. It's a good pick. So my pick is actually nothing to do with development at all, but I couldn't think of anything else. But I've been doing a lot of video content creation recently and learning about video editing. And there's a free editor, which is kind of just as good as Premiere Pro, which is quite expensive. And a lot of people are moving over from Premiere Pro to this, which is DaVinci Resolve. And there's a paid for version, but the free version, you don't need any more than that. And I know that as developers, we do sometimes have requirements to create videos. And given this is free, it's just such an amazing piece of software. Anything you'd expect from something like Premiere Pro, that kind of level of software. So I'll include a link to that in the show notes.
That's cool. I'm going to be downloading that very shortly. I used to be a user of Premiere, and I couldn't afford to buy it these days, that's for sure. Not for the stuff that I do.
Well, there's so many YouTube videos on how, like, going through how to use it and stuff, and lots of people are just like moving over from Premiere Pro to it. And it's incredible that it's free. There is DaVinci Resolve Studio, it's the paid for version. But the features, I think that the core difference is that the paid for version runs on your GPU, where the free one uses your CPU.
Oh, okay.
But if you've got a decent CPU, it's fine.
Yeah, I'm sure most people have got the time to render things out rather than the money to pay for a full
Exactly. Yeah. But yeah, it's just so good. So yeah, I'll link to that in the show notes. So before we wrap up, where's the best place for listeners to reach out to you if they've got any questions or anything?
So I'm on Twitter. My alias is does.net because I does.net. I didn't really think about that when I started it. And LinkedIn, Matt__Hunt. I don't tweet a lot, but I definitely respond to any ats or any messages. So yeah, find me, hit me up.
And you're also on our Discord now as well. So I need to update and give you the guest tag in our Discord.
Oh, fantastic. That sounds so. I've never used Discord until the other day.
It's so good.
Yeah, so I'm still learning. It's like every new thing. There's lots of things flashing at you. So I'm looking forward to having this guest tag. Brilliant.
We've moved over both the podcast and .NET Docs with the user group I run. We were both on Slack. We moved over to Discord, and it's just way better. One thing I really like about it is that your account sits above all the different Discords you're in. They call them Discord servers, which is a bit of a weird name because it's like a Slack organization. It's not a server.
Instances or what
exactly,
have you. Yeah.
But your account is above that. So if you send me a DM on Discord, it's got nothing to do with the podcast Discord or the .NET Docs Discord, where with Slack, a DM's inside
that one instance.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no. So I'm looking forward to doing more Discording, if that's what it's called.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
I think you just invented the verb.
Yes. Oh, there we go. Winning.
Awesome stuff. So with that, I think we're probably just about out of time. But thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. And I apologise so much for all the technical failures.
Not a problem at all. Thanks for having me. It's I wouldn't say it's a dream come true because you told me I was too fanboy before, but it was definitely a pleasure to come on and have a chat to you. Finally, catch up with you. But
you did say it was a dream come true, though. That's why I said that.
There's no proof.
There is. It's on Discord.
Yes, on Discord.
Oh, so funny. Yeah. Awesome. And just a big thank you for everyone for listening, and a quick reminder that this podcast, so I can't speak now, is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you enjoy the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter @Drakan, and my DMs are open. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all my social stuff too. And we'll include links to all the stuff we've mentioned today in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.